Welcome to Fast Forward Newsline. My name is Michael Welch. Joining us today is Alon Weinberg. He is one of the contributors, one of the programmers at CKUW Radio. So, Alon, you're bringing us an interesting story of challenge and change, and this concerns something known as the BDS movement. So, do you want to just maybe quickly explain what we mean by BDS?
Right. BDS is the movement of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Currently, that strategy refers to a movement started by Palestinian civil society to pressure Israel through economic measures to end its occupation of the West Bank and to move towards a negotiated settlement with the Palestinian people who have been under Israeli occupation since 1967 and some would argue 1948. In different measures. It is modeled on the South African apartheid movement, anti-apartheid movement, pardon me, that really tried to pressure South Africa to end its apartheid back in the 80s. And at this point, many Palestinian civil society organizations have called for BDS, and it's a movement that's spreading, especially on campuses around the world, and various corporations are coming under pressure as well to not do business either with Israel or specifically with West Bank communities. So there's, a variance within that movement, and now is the phase where it's probably reaching its global critical mass, such that we're seeing, a bit of a crackdown.
It's enjoying some success.
I mean, its victories are not universal at this point, but there have been some tactics that have pressured some companies, for example in Israel, like SodaStream, to shut down its West Bank operation and move into Israel proper, rather than to do it on illegally occupied land. And so, yeah, it is, the large corporate security company, I think the largest in the world, G4S, has also withdrawn out of Israel. Now, when a company does that, it's not always clear. They don't announce, we're doing this because we support BDS, but it's clear that they feel the pressure. And the divestment aspect is probably hitting them more than any sort of simple activist boycott calls. It's that larger funds are starting to actually divest from companies who do business in occupied West Bank.
So tell us about the pushback. I understand there's a story out of New York that shows some impatience with this.
Well, it's beyond, I think, impatience. It's an effort to counter the BDS movement using state power to put a chill on the movement and on any companies thinking of divesting from Israel because of the movement's force and power. So in the New York State legislature, there was a bill being debated for many, many weeks that would actually sort of boycott back any civil society organizations or corporations that engage in boycott, divestment, or sanctions over Israel. Now, it wasn't looking like the bill was going to pass, and so the governor, Andrew Cuomo, a Democrat, became impatient and signed an Executive Order 157, that basically said, and this was his summary of the bill, if you boycott Israel, we will boycott you. So what they're going to do, this is modeled on a series of other states' laws that compile a list of companies and organizations that are publicly divesting from Israel or boycotting Israel if they're civil society organizations or even universities for that matter, and making them ineligible for, in the case of a civil society organization, any state funding. In the case of a corporation, they will no longer be able to do business in the state of New York. So it's a counter boycott.
I'm wondering if there's anything comparable happening in Canada.
There have been efforts, there have been motions put before various provincial legislatures along with in the Parliament of Canada. So far, it seems to me they have been more symbolic than having such teeth as to counter boycott. There was a motion in Parliament that the Liberals, the new Liberal government of Justin Trudeau, felt somewhat, I think they felt somewhat bullied into having to go along with the momentum of this Conservative motion that would basically condemn those partaking in BDS in Canada. But it did pass the motion, but it did not have the same force as a law or a bill might. As well, recently, last week, in Ontario's provincial parliament, a PC, Progressive Conservative, sponsored motion to as well condemn those engaged in boycott, divestment, and sanctions, was defeated quite handily, I think something like 3-1, and it was a free vote as well. One of the ironies was that the Premier Kathleen Wynne of the Liberal Party was actually on a business trade in the West Bank, business trade trip in the West Bank. I haven't looked into that to see if she was meeting with Palestinian governance or with Israeli companies in the West Bank. I'm not quite sure. But the Liberals did leave it to an open vote, and I think only one Liberal ended up supporting the motion. The rest voted against it. And so there's a big concern that trying to condemn people engaged in a civil rights struggle for Palestinian rights on the basis that their actions are construed and framed as being anti-Semitic, in the end, that argument in the long term probably wouldn't hold water, but more so on the issues of free speech and charter rights, it's not likely such a law in Canada would even survive. And I think there will also be challenges to the laws in the United States.
Oh, interesting. So this, it may not have a lot of teeth, but do you see these efforts as undermining the boycott movement?
In Canada, the motions, I don't think they necessarily undermine the movement. I think what they do is bring more attention to it. There's the famous Gandhi quote, that first they ignore you and later they attack you and then you win. And I think putting that kind of effort of the state, this sort of heavy-handed effort to tell people they cannot mobilize for Palestinian rights using boycott, divestment, or sanctions tactics, the very same one that I think most Canadians would agree was worthy in the struggle in South Africa apartheid. And I'm not comparing the two as identical situations, but nonetheless, tactically, these are internationally recognized tactics. They have a precedence. I think that heavy-handed approach will end up simply creating more sympathizers with the movement of BDS. So I think it's not a very nuanced strategy for Israeli apologists to be pushing this if they are in fact the lobby efforts behind such bills, because in the end what they're just doing is drawing more attention to the movement itself, and an issue which perhaps was still yet a minor issue among leftist activists becomes a more mainstreamly discussed issue, because everyone, I think, takes notice when things like free speech is being challenged.
Now, there seems to be a particularly extreme example happening in France in terms of what this, the crackdown on BDS. And do you want to share some of the concerns you've raised around that?
Well, in France, there was a law on the books since 2003 called the Lelouch Law, after the parliamentarian who helped write it. And it doesn't specifically target BDS. What it does is actually make nationality one of the categories that is protected under hate speech laws. So just like you cannot make a general comment on a group's religion publicly, you will be prosecuted on, if it's a negative comment, you'll be prosecuted under hate speech laws, or sexuality, or many other categories. Nationality is now considered, since 2003 actually, a protected identity category. And so it has been used, that Lelouch Law, in the last couple years to prosecute activists for BDS. And what I guess the state is saying is, if you are calling out Israel or signaling out Israel for its policies, you're therefore discriminating against people of Israeli nationality. Now, I think it goes further to insinuate that you're discriminating against Jews who support Israel. For me, it's troubling because there seems to be a conflation between nationality and a nation-state's policies, right? If someone were to hold a protest, suppose I was a student in Massachusetts, and some people in Massachusetts held a protest against Canadian treatment of Indigenous people. Would they be discriminating against me personally? I think everyone can see, personally or as a Canadian, in any event, I think anyone can clearly see that that is a very strange connection to make. especially in law. I mean, it's bad enough in discourse that these connections are made. For it to become law, I think it's reached the point of absurdity, and I think the discourse is highly polarized and emotionally charged. And when you're making law based on, the concerns of one group's emotional concerns, you're not necessarily taking reason and rational law into consideration. And so I think this is an example where the Lelouch law, in and of itself, may have had merit. Perhaps there are ultra right-wing politicians condemning entire national groups, as opposed to being religious groups. As opposed to, say, like Donald Trump condemning Muslims, there may be right-wing politicians in France condemning Algerians or any other group from a country, right? So therefore, it might make sense, the Lelouch law, more than the executive order in New York. It's the application of it to the BDS movement. 12 activists were recently arrested for putting stickers in a supermarket on produce that came from the West Bank, from Jewish settlements in the West Bank, which is considered under international law to be an illegal settlement because it is land that was occupied through war. So I think it's an absurd thing to try to use the Lelouch law in France and to condemn people who are actually, in the end, not only not anti-Semitic, generally these are people who struggle for universal rights, and there may be some anti-Semites in the movement. There probably are in every single movement, but it seems absurd to try to tar the entire movement with that brush and to institutionalize that tarring of an entire group with a single brush in law. And that's, for me, where I get more concerned that our state structures would go that far away from, I think, reasonable legislation.
Fascinating topic. Alon Weinberg, thank you very much for sharing that information with us.
Thanks for talking with me, Michael.
You've been listening to Fast Forward Newsline. A fresh edition appears regularly inside this little box. If you would like to be a sponsor of Fast Forward Newsline, just send a message to greenplanetmonitor.net. We'd like to thank the support of the Government of Canada, the Social Justice Fund of Unifor, and the Community Radio Fund of Canada. My name is Michael Welch. Bye for now.